It was in the DNA of being a white nationalist. It's in the DNA of being a Proud Boy. It's in the DNA of being a Klansman. It's in the DNA of being a neo-Nazi skinhead or, American Nazi Party, that they are better and they must eliminate, not just separate, they must eliminate the enemy.
Hey everybody, Marianne Williamson here. Welcome to the podcast. Well, these are dramatic times. We have a new president of the United States, much to be excited about in terms of possibilities for the future, but also, as we're all aware, much to be concerned about as well, a kind of hangover from the past, particularly the problem of right-wing hate groups, white supremacist groups that are core to the riot at the U.S. Capitol on January 6th. Now, quite a bit ago, a few weeks ago, I interviewed Christian Picciolini. And Christian is someone who is an expert on this topic. He knows all about white supremacist groups and skinheads and neo-Nazis. Why? Because he once was one. He wrote a book called Breaking Hate, Confronting the New Culture of Extremism, which is one of the best things I have ever read on this subject. He not only describes the problem from the inside, but he also describes how to dismantle it. He is now someone called a former, someone who has been a part of one of those groups and is now an expert at helping people to de-radicalize. But before I introduce you to Christian, I want to read you something. When I was preparing to talk to you today, I remembered the line from the book A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens, a line we've all heard so many times. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. And when I was thinking about the fact that we do have a new administration, we do have in many ways new possibilities and hopes for the future, but at the same time, we have such things as white supremacist terrorist groups that are among us. This idea, best of times, worst of times. But when we actually looked at the book, the entire paragraph speaks almost eerily about the times in which we live. Listen to this. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, and it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief. It was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light. It was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope. It was the winter of despair. Wow. He wrote that in 1859, about the 18th century, and boy, could anybody describe better the times in which we live. A lot of people are asking, what's going to happen now? What's going to happen now? And it's so important that we're very clear about this. What's going to happen is what we make happen. It's not already written. And I believe that what we need is, as a generation of people, and by a generation of people, I mean all of the adults who are alive right now, we must become profoundly intentional. We must completely avoid either minimizing the problem, distracting ourselves from the problem, normalizing the problem, or in any way acting like we don't have any choice in the matter of what happens now. We must find white supremacist hate groups absolutely unacceptable. They are an assault on our democracy. Now, I'm somebody who, I remember years ago when the FBI and other intelligence agencies were warning us about right-wing domestic terrorism. And I remember how people on the right squelched that conversation because they didn't really want the American people to realize the severity of the problem. And so many of the things that happened during the Trump administration, it was just like issue after issue, incident after incident, thing he said after something else that he said, that had a lot of people going, this is a fascist playbook here. What are we allowing to happen? Well, I think by January 6th, many more millions of people were very, very clear about what was happening. And what we have to be clear about now is that it needs to stop. Now, in my own career, Martin Luther King talked about how love is the ultimate political tool. So did Gandhi. And sometimes I myself, I remember when the Proud Boys were in Washington, D.C. a few weeks ago, and they were tearing down BLM signs, and they were, in some cases, burning them, and they were actually terrorizing people on the street, starting to beat up some people. And this fierceness came up in me because, I'm very clear. Love doesn't mean you don't set boundaries. Love doesn't mean sometimes you don't say no. Love doesn't mean you don't take care of a problem when it's in your midst. But I have to say that I did wake up the next morning asking myself, where does love fit in? Because I'm very, very clear in terms of the neo-fascist threat that is in our midst today. And as we all know, the fact that Donald Trump's not president anymore doesn't mean that this threat is gone. I'm someone who believes very strongly we must all be we must have zero tolerance for this. We have seen it grow. We have watched it happen. And after January 6th, there is absolutely no excuse for the people of the United States not setting every boundary that we need to set to make sure that fascism does not destroy our democracy. But I ask myself, where does love fit in? And in reading Breaking Hate, I'm happy to tell you that Christian Picciolini makes very clear where love fits in. He talks about the psychological mindset and the very common childhood background of many of the people who become lured into authoritarian groups, neo-Nazi groups, skinhead groups, etc. He himself was radicalized when he was only 14 years old. And he, having been drawn into the skinheads at the age of 14, remained there until he was 22 years old. He is the founder of the Free Radicals Project, a global network of people working to prevent extremism and helping people disengage from hate movements and other violent ideologies. That's what we're going to have to do. We have to be very clear about this. We are going to have to figure out a way to prevent this, and we are going to have to figure out a way to help people disengage from these hate movements. But actually, when I just said we have to figure it out, it's not so much that we have to figure it out as that we have to listen to people like Christian Picciolini who know the answers. You know, I have noticed this for years, and it was very much a part of why I even wanted to run for president. You know, it was Bill Clinton who said there's nothing wrong with America that can't be made right by what's right with America. And he was absolutely right, I believe, because I have seen so much, I've traveled so much in this country, and everywhere where we have a problem, and we have some very serious problems in this country, we also have the people, the projects, the geniuses, the expertise of people who absolutely know how to solve that problem. However, the problem solvers are often in our society the least resourced. They're given the least money. They're the ones who are given, you know, a grant of $50,000 here, or a grant of $100,000 there, or some corporate grant, while meanwhile the problem creators are given huge multi-billion-dollar subsidies and tax breaks. This is what we've got to change. If we want a peaceful society, if we want a strong democracy, then we need to start feeding our democracy, nourishing our democracy. If we want peace, we must begin to feed peace and to nourish peace. And right now, when you're talking about the kind of violent extremism that we're seeing in our country and that we know exists, we better get to work. And people like Christian Picciolini will guide us. He can tell us what we need to do. He has helped hundreds of people escape white supremacy. In 2016, he won an Emmy Award for producing an anti-hate advertising campaign aimed at helping people disengage from extremism. His disengagement work is also spotlighted in an MSNBC documentary series called Breaking Hate. I think he's fascinating. I think he's brilliant. I think the fact that he's been there, he knows whereof he speaks, and he has, boy, has this man made it through to the other side. He's made it through to the other side on every possible level, to the point where I can honestly say it was an honor to speak to him. Here we go. I hope you enjoy this. Christian Picciolini. Christian Picciolini, thank you so much for being here. I'm very, very grateful. I'm quite honored to have you.
Thank you, Marianne. It's an honor to be here. Also a privilege. People like me that look like me often get second chances, but we still live in a society where Black and brown people aren't getting first chances, and I always want to make sure and point that out, that point of privilege.
Well, your work is very important in helping America have a second chance about something that is a deep shadow that has only deepened, apparently, according to you and according to our own experience over the last few years. You are informing us of something extremely important, and this information is born by your own experience, and that's what makes you, of course, not only so knowledgeable, but so compelling. A lot of people have heard your story, but just for anybody who hasn't, the fact that you yourself, as a 14-year-old, raised by loving parents, but who themselves were economically squeezed. I think that's significant according to everything that you've said. They themselves were economically squeezed. They themselves did not have the time, perhaps, the bandwidth, the energy to give you the energy that you needed growing up. And at 14 years old, you encountered someone who gave you what you thought you needed and led you straight down a path to hell. Can you please, I'm sure everybody's asked you this now about 1,000 times, but just for those who haven't heard it, would you tell us your story?
Yeah, absolutely. And you're absolutely correct. I came from a loving family. But in 1987, when I was 14 years old, I was standing in an alley, kind of a delinquent loner at the time, and I was smoking a joint, and a man came up to me with a shaved head and wearing boots, and he pulled a joint from my mouth, and he looked me in the eyes, and he said, "That's what the communists and the Jews want you to do to keep you docile." If I'm being honest, at 14, I didn't know what a communist was, if I'd met a Jewish person, or even what the word docile meant. But it felt as though he was the first person that seemed to pull me in. But I want to take a step back, because before that, really, to clarify your point, I came from a very loving, normal family. My parents are Italian immigrants who came to the U.S. in the mid-'60s. And when they arrived, they were often the victims of prejudice. They struggled to really make a living. So it wasn't for a lack of love on my part. It really was for a lack of attention growing up. They were often busy working 6-7 days a week, 16 hours a day. And I went looking for three very important things outside of my home. And that was a sense of identity, community, and purpose. And standing in that alley in 1987, who turned out to be America's first neo-Nazi skinhead leader, found me and promised me those three things. And I jumped in head first, because it was really the first time in my life that I'd felt seen, and not really knowing exactly what I'd gotten into. And I stayed involved for 8 years. Was a member of a neo-Nazi skinhead group, in fact, America's first neo-Nazi skinhead group on the south side of Chicago, where I'm from. And became a leader within that movement, and really used that time to spread hatred, to sow division, to be violent, and to propagate and promote hateful ideologies that unfortunately 30 years later are still thriving.
Well, when you say 30 years later are still thriving, from what I read in your book and have read elsewhere, it is more than that they're thriving, it's that they're growing. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct.
And growing to a point where you and others say we have a serious epidemic on our hands. Just recently in Washington, D.C., the Proud Boys. Now, let me ask you right now, when you talk about Nazi skinheads, this is part of a larger phenomenon of, how would you describe this? White supremacists, hate groups. Tell me what they stand for. What is the agenda? What is the philosophy that they taught you? I know you talk in the book that basically you were taught, and it's straight out of Hitler's book. It's that there's a global agenda led by Jews, and that the goal is to protect the white civilization, which I've never understood because Jews usually white, but that Jews, black people, and immigrants are the enemy. And they have this horrible globalist agenda, and they must be fought. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, if we look at it kind of like an umbrella structure of institutional and systemic racism, and within that you have white supremacists, people who believe that the white race is superior to all other races on Earth, and that those other races are pushing them out of positions of prominence and power and control, and that something called a great replacement is coming, that they are being replaced. And we heard that, shouted at in
Jews shall not replace us.
Exactly, in places like Charlottesville. And the conspiracy theories that I bought into as a 14-year-old kid in the 1980s, that, the Jews controlled media and entertainment and finance systems and were pulling the strings behind the scenes. I had to find that in a dark alley, quite literally in a dark alley, on the south side of Chicago. And now we have the internet, where that dark alley is really available to everybody 24 hours a day. And those same conspiracy theories are not only thriving, but they are growing. They're reaching more people. I got out after 8 years. When I was 23 years old, through the compassion of the people that I had hurt. They showed me compassion, and I was able to find my way out. And since then, I've spent the better part of the last 20 years trying to educate people, trying to warn people about this growing and thriving problem of white supremacy in our country. And not just the systemic and institutional parts, but the organized chaos agents that are out there trying to hurt other people as well.
What are the names of these groups?
Well, there are a lot of them, unfortunately. Under that umbrella of white supremacy that I was talking about, you have different flavors, if you will. What I was a white power or a neo-Nazi skinhead. I believed in the general tenets of white supremacy, like I mentioned earlier, but it had its own style. Nowadays, groups have really moved away from being so visible until really recently. It wasn't in their best interest to stay visible like it was in the beginning. When I was a skinhead in the 1980s, we needed to be seen. That was part of the MO, to terrorize people, to be able to show them that we were there. But then it became a liability. So people like David Duke, who took off the Klan robe and put on the three-piece suit of a politician and were elected to the House of Representatives in Louisiana, started to recognize the value of not being so visible, of mainstreaming their ideologies and trying to reach more conservative groups and some of the more fringe groups on the right. And skinheads followed. And today you have, the alt-right movement that wears polos and khakis and marched in Charlottesville. And, by the look of them, you wouldn't recognize that they were part of any movement. But you have also groups like Proud Boys that are reminiscent more of the skinheads that I used to be a part of. They all dress the same. They wear the same uniforms. They get the same tattoos. In some instances, they even wear the same types of fashion brands that skinheads wore. And while I wouldn't say that they are, a neo-Nazi group, they are a white supremacist adjacent group. They are, what they believe in, in their own words, is Western chauvinism, right? Well, Western chauvinism is white male supremacy. And if we're taking off the wrapping of their fancy words, it's white male supremacy. So they are pushing a white nationalist, white supremacist agenda, but you're absolutely correct. The violence that they bring to the streets is reminiscent of the 1930s, of the early days of Hitler coming into power, of Nazis going onto the streets to terrorize people. Things like Kristallnacht, where they terrorized Jewish-owned stores, and it was the real beginning of a regime. Where I think it's different, though, where I think that there is some hope, is that what we're seeing is at the tail end of the Trump regime, right? And hopefully with a new direction can come some progress. If we were to have a second Trump administration, I'd be very, very concerned. But that's not to say I'm not still concerned about what is going to be happening with Trumpism over the next 4, 10, 20 years.
So these internet sites such as Stormfront, Daily Stormer, they are used to radicalize youth. And this is not dissimilar from the ways that many, particularly young men, are radicalized in places in the Middle East, et cetera. Yeah. You talked about the ICP in your own life, the lack of identity, the lack of community, and lack of purpose. And you talk a lot in the book about how these are the young people at risk. I think the concentration on youth is so significant, just like in your own experience. Somebody came up to you were a 14-year-old kid, somebody seemed to see you. Yeah. Somebody seemed to acknowledge your importance because they were trying to get you. Another group that you talk about as prey, it's ideological capture, isn't it? And they prey on certain people. Also, you talk in your book about how many veterans are so easily preyed on. At-risk teenagers are preyed on, veterans are preyed on. And then you talk in the book about how so often, you're talking here about infiltration into our armed forces that has occurred, how a lot of people are radicalized in prison, and you talk about how so often law enforcement is infiltrated. We all saw pictures of policemen from Texas, for instance, who had badges of the Oath Keepers on their jackets. This is something which, according to the FBI and other intelligence agencies, is already a serious problem, and they've been talking about it for a long time. But what you just said is that with Trump as president, there was wink, wink given to many of these groups. Now, the Homeland Security, one of the things that I found interesting in your book was you said that the Department of Homeland Security was giving grants to people whose work was like yours to de-radicalize some of these people who had been radicalized. And you had been given a $400,000 grant to set up an internet system that would help with the de-radicalization. But when Sebastian Gorka became head of that part of Homeland Security, when Trump was president, he took away your $400,000 grant. They got rid of that. My first question to you is, do you think that you'll be getting it back in a Biden administration? But secondly, Gorka said that the reason he was taking it away was because anti-black, anti-Jewish, anti-immigrant, anti-LGBTQ groups. This isn't where the real problem was. That the real problem was groups like Antifa, which you say is small comparatively. So those are the two things I want to know about. Number one, do you think you'll get your grant back? Will this kind of de-radicalization get supported by the Biden administration, do you believe? And secondly, talk to us about Antifa, because some people see a moral equivalence here. They say, oh, what about Antifa? And I'm like, I don't think so. I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, no, and I'm happy to address both of those. The organization I used to be with was promised a grant under the Obama administration. It was never paid out, and then when Trump took office, that grant was rescinded. Out of 40 groups that were given grants under that program, DHS, 39 of them were focused on, Islamist extremism, and we were the only organization focused on white supremacy.
Okay.
And what happened was they rescinded the grant before it was even paid out. I do hope that in this new administration that there will be a focus on preventing extremism, and I think that they will fund organizations and projects that are doing good work. I sure hope so, because right now, groups like the one that I run, the Free Radicals Project, are really not only helping people disengage from these organizations, but in many cases preventing acts of violence from happening in the future. And we have helped hundreds of people disengage, and maybe even more, as far as prevention. So I do hope that they will focus on that.
Has there been anything said to you or said to anyone or made public by anyone around the Biden incoming administration to make you think there's enough of a realization on the part of that group that this is something that the new Justice Department and Homeland Security is going to have to deal with?
Well, I think, the new incoming administration still is unclear on how they'll be able to communicate with those organizations. They haven't yet, right, as far as I know, except for maybe some of the daily briefings. So I think it'll become more clear after January 20th. I have hope. I think that there are some very smart people talking about this, and very good people with some loud voices who are talking about this problem of infiltration in the military and in law enforcement, and that we do need to address that. I also do believe that we need a Truth and Reconciliation Committee going forward, because we talked about identity, community, and purpose for people becoming radicalized, and potholes. In my book, I talk a lot about potholes as the things leading people to the fringes or detouring them on their life's journey towards toxic identity, community, and purpose. And potholes are things like trauma and abuse and poverty, and even privilege can be a massive pothole. But as a nation, we are also, I think, struggling right now for a sense of identity, community, and purpose. And we have some historical potholes that have gone unaddressed for 400 years. And unless we address those historical potholes within our society, within our nation, I don't know that we'll be able to move forward. I don't know that we'll be able to have real progress and real change without addressing the issues of slavery and Jim Crow and the institutional and systemic racism that still exists today, because that is a factory that creates extremism. It breeds uncertainty, and those are the types of things that we need to fix. So not only do I help people repair their potholes to help them disengage from extremism, I think we need to do that for America right now. Yeah.
Well, I've certainly known and written and spoken quite a bit about the historical shadows. But the thing about your work that is particularly terrifying is problems we have right in the present, which I believe in a way are a blowback against what is a perceived exaltation of the rights of Blacks, of immigrants, and so forth. One of the things you say in the book is that people might have thought through the 90s and the early 2000s that hate crimes were going down, but actually a lot of these people were just regrouping. They were rebranding themselves, as you said. David Duke puts on a business suit. Richard Spencer comes across like a suave kind of almost intellectual guy. And, I think this is something for all of us to think about. You already have QAnon supporters who have been elected to Congress. And you talk in your book about how some of these white supremacists will be planning to run for office. And am I correct? That's what you were saying.
Yeah, we're seeing it now. I mean, you're absolutely right. We've got several people, with very proud QAnon ties who are successfully making their way into politics. Several very white nationalist adjacent, people on the conservative side who are, certainly have won seats and are running for stuff. And this is a problem
Yes,
that's growing.
when you talk about the fringe ideology of these white supremacist groups, there is nothing new here. This is exactly what Hitler said. Hitler said that there was a master race, the Aryan race, and that anybody like Jews, black people, immigrants, they sullied it. They were like weeds in the garden. You had to cut out the weeds, take out the weeds. And of course, over and over and over again, that the Jews were heading the whole thing.
But let's not forget,
sorry, go on.
Let's not forget, Marianne, where Hitler got so many of his ideas, both on, his views on blacks and Jews, and that was from American Jim Crow and from people like Henry Ford, somebody who we revere, who for years wrote something called the International Jew, which was, in his newspapers, published articles and opinion articles that were anti-Semitic. Those were ideas that came straight out of America. So, we can pawn this off on other folks all we want, but it still circles back to the white supremacist culture that we founded here 400 years ago.
That is so true. There is the mythology around Henry Ford is pretty outrageous. He also had private guards shoot his workers when there was first talk of unionization, et cetera. So I know what you're saying absolutely to be true. Now, what you do, you meet the person who is a radical, and you are what is called in that field a former.
Correct.
One of the people who is a former white supremacist, Nazi skinhead, or whatever. Now, I found your conversation around how to de-radicalize people very moving. It's very poignant. You don't make people wrong. People will say to me a lot, and you hear it all the time, well, we have to listen to the other side. And I'll say all the time, well, I understand listening to conservatives. I mean, there are high-minded conservative principles and there are high-minded liberal principles. I understand we need to listen to each other. But don't tell me I have to listen to the Nazi. But what I learned from your book is, yes, actually, Marianne, you do have to even listen to the Nazi, not because they are correct, but because the very act of listening is an ameliorative. The very act of listening shows the kind of compassion and respect wherein it is easier for someone to come see change themselves. Mm. You talk about redemption being possible. Yeah. I want to hear more about that. I think your views of how to treat someone who is or the story that you tell about the man who came back from the war overseas in Iraq, I believe. He just wanted to kill Muslims, and you asked if you ever met one. Yeah. And then you took him over to a mosque, and he became a good friend with the imam. So please let us hear from you. How do you see your work and how you approach people psychologically and emotionally who are lost in the bonds of this hatred?
Yeah, one of the things that I talk about in my book, which is probably one of the hardest concepts to understand, is something I call see the child, not the monster. And it doesn't matter if the child is 16 or 60. So much of what led them to that ideology or that, what I call a suit of armor that they wear to protect themselves in many cases, it was learned. It was something that, they certainly weren't born with it. It was something that they latched onto to protect themselves. And oftentimes what I found is it's not hatred of anybody else. That's how it manifests. But really and truly, it's about hatred for themselves being projected onto other people. But I should say that redemption without accountability is just privilege. I don't give anybody a free pass when I work with them. I still hold them accountable, but I force them to kind of navigate that accountability themselves and to kind of bring it up themselves. Self-realization, self-awareness is really important in the process of disengagement. And allowing them to realize that they're wrong and say it themselves is much more powerful than me telling them that they're wrong.
There's a paragraph from your book I'd like to read. It says, and I avoid calling them monsters, as you just said. I don't label them with anything demeaning because I understand the negative implications of such dehumanizing tactics. Instead, I work hard to earn their trust, and I listen with empathy, responding with equal parts cautious vulnerability and measured compassion. I help them uncover the truth about who they really are, keeping accountability for their misdeeds at the fore as the terms for their forgiveness going forward. What often moves me is not what people say, but instead the pain, trauma, and uncertainty they say little about or that no words can describe.
Yeah, and those are the potholes that I encounter with everybody that I've worked with. Nobody has ever told me that they were born to hate. It's something that they found after a series of life events, and those toxic ideologies are always very good at trying to help explain the pain to these people by placing the cause of their pain on somebody else and never on themselves.
And once again, this all has historical precedent. After World War I, the Allies were so hard on the German people. The reparations were basically Deutschmark till we tell you to stop. And that collective desperation became a petri dish, which made the emergence of Hitler much easier because large groups of desperate people are vulnerable to ideological capture by genuinely psychotic forces. And that's what we're talking about here, just like we were talking about it in Germany decades ago, are we not?
Yeah, no, we're talking about that same uncertainty.
One of the things that I appreciated about the book, which seems so important to me, is this concentration on young people, your own experience being an example. We have millions of American children who are living with chronic trauma. And this is one of the reasons I worry so much about what's going on right now with lack of stimulus checks. There are children, we already had 1 in 5 American children who were food insecure. Now it's moving up to 1 in 4. What we are breeding right now with the way the government is taking care of Wall Street but not Main Street, there are children in these families, and these children will grow out to be angry and traumatized adults. And according to what you're saying and what history shows us, they will be easy prey for people like this, because they won't be told it was Mitch McConnell and Nancy Pelosi who couldn't come to agreement. They will more likely be told it was blacks who were doing this to you, it's immigrants who were doing this to you, it's Jews who were doing it to you, et cetera.
Yeah.
I know this is a more obvious question, but when you're talking about these internet sites that radicalize these young people and that the FBI knows about, certainly Mark Zuckerberg knows about it, I know this is an obvious question, why can't they take down the sites?
Well, I mean, we live in a country where, free speech is a right that we hold dear. And while free speech and, First Amendment and things like that don't apply to private companies, I think there's still a struggle to define, what we can say and what we can't. I am a proponent, frankly, because we live in such a virtual world, that we do need some laws that apply in the real world must apply in the virtual world, such as hate crime laws. You can terrorize somebody by painting a swastika on a synagogue, and it has the same effect if you Photoshop their face over the gates of Auschwitz and terrorize their family with that photo. So I think we do need to understand this new frontier of the internet. But just to be clear, it's not just neo-Nazi sites that are radicalizing people. It's YouTube, where videos of white nationalism are mixed in with videos of video games, mixed in with skateboarding videos, and anybody can come across this stuff. You don't have to just go to a Nazi site anymore.
I want to ask you about the video games, because you say the violent video games aren't even the ones to be afraid of anymore. Talk to us more about that. I think parents want to know, what should they be on the lookout for? What are the things that all of us should know? Wow, that might indicate a problem.
Well, I think, a couple things. Predators tend to go to places where there are vulnerable people gathered. They're looking for low-hanging fruit in most cases. So they will go to where young people are gathered, where they can bet that, a significant number of those young people are searching for identity, community, and purpose and may not be finding it. So multiplayer online video games, it's not the content that is radicalizing people. It's the fact that our kids are talking to people, who knows where in the world over their headsets while they're playing with these video games. In some cases, I've seen it, in let's say a Call of Duty, a shooter type game with 15 or so people playing. The way it happens is somebody will say the N-word just in the course of gameplay, and they'll gauge how people respond to that. Some kids might push back and say something because somebody said it. Some might laugh because it's a nervous giggle. They might be a 12-year-old that doesn't even know what else to do. And some people might go along with it and support it. Well, they invite those people to other separate rooms and they play, and they keep whittling it down until they get a core group of followers that when you say the N-word, or when you crack anti-Semitic jokes, or when you say misogynistic things, that everybody's laughing, and suddenly you have built a self-sustaining community that can thrive. They also go to places where, people who are vulnerable are searching for help. Places like online depression forums or autism communities where people are trying to get self-help or do research for, what they might be dealing with in their life. And they're again betting on the fact that in real life they may not have access to friends or close associates to confide in, and they may be searching with significant potholes in many cases for that identity, community, and purpose, which they offer fraudulently but in spades.
Well,
it's very evident that once you are part of that movement, that identity, community, and purpose drive everything that they do.
Well, what you make clear in the book is how very, very sophisticated these efforts have become. Like you said, going to a teenage support group for depression online. I mean, how evil is that? The places that they will go to prey on people. And then you also bring up in the book that some of this infiltration, some of this preying on people doesn't appear to even be coming from other Americans, correct?
No, I think in many cases it's being amplified or even in many cases driven by places in Eastern Europe or Russia, troll farms, propaganda farms. They love to sow chaos in our country, so they latch on to the wounds that they know we have, and they pour salt in them. In many cases, they amplify the voices that are divisive because it keeps us in disarray. But I want to be really clear. We talk a lot about young people searching for identity, community, and purpose with potholes and being vulnerable to radicalization. But what has been really clear in the last couple of years is it's not just young people, it's also people, let's say, who are at retirement age, who are now also looking for a new sense of identity, community, and purpose after maybe they've left a job or they've lost a spouse and are dealing with potholes like divorce, unemployment, all these things, and are now living on places like Facebook and have access to this propaganda. So it does explain these new kind of fringe movements like QAnon, or the fact that, we're seeing white nationalism spread in the mainstream to all of these people who, with layer of uncertainty on top of each other, pandemic, unemployment, protest, election, everything is uncertain right now. It is the perfect storm for radicalization into these types of ecosystems.
Many years ago, I lived in Michigan, and I became aware of many of the problems with missing children, particularly missing girls, and sex slavery. And I had a friend who was a Supreme Court justice in Michigan at the time. Because I was with her, I was able to listen in on a phone call that she had with someone highly placed at the FBI. And what he told her was that they were very aware. He made very clear with the conversation they were having, they knew about this. Would it be your impression that the people who need to know, whether it's the FBI, Homeland Security, all of the agencies, Department of Justice that need to know about this, I just want to know, do they know? I mean, is somebody on it? I mean, I know, for instance, if you go onto the website when it has to do with sex with children, pedophilia, etc., I know the efforts are at least being made. Are you under the impression, I mean, you tell stories in the book about how you told the FBI this or you told the FBI that, and things where obviously they did not act on what you said, and some terrible things happened, and worse things could have happened because they did not act on your information.
Yeah, I don't think that law enforcement is underfunded. I think that they're underdirected in terms of where to focus their attention. I think we have really good people, really talented people who can do the job, except that the mandate isn't there. In fact, we live in a country where we can't even agree that there is a white supremacy problem. Let alone that we need to make it a priority to focus on. I can tell you that both. The answer is yes, we have a massive problem, and we also have a massive threat that is greater than any other foreign or domestic threat that we've seen since 9/11 at least.
I want you to describe what the threat is. In 2017, the FBI reported that 7,000 hate crimes were documented in the United States the previous year. This is all from your book. You say the Anti-Defamation League has published a similarly chilling report in 2019, concluding that incidents of American far-right violence had accounted for almost all hate-related murders in 2018. Then you also talk about how it's part of a global web. You mentioned the massacre at the Christchurch in Christchurch in New Zealand and so forth. But I think a lot of people go, yeah, there's some violent thugs out there. Would you name a little more so that people can get a sense of how big this is and how well organized some of this is and how sophisticated some of this has become? We're talking about a terrorist threat here in the United States. And you talk in the book about the fact that this terrorism in the United States has killed more people than killed people in 9/11. So I'd like to hear. And also I want to circle back, compare that to Antifa. because that's what you get from a lot of people like, oh, no different than Antifa. So I'm throwing it back to you now.
Yeah, and let me start with Antifa because I did forget to answer that as part of your question too. And I get asked this question a lot, and I'll answer it the same way. Until we start seeing a death toll, until we start seeing casualties from this thing called Antifa, which is short for anti-fascist action, for people that don't know that, and I'll explain that a little bit more. Until we start seeing that, I can't justify that same threat. If we want to equate violence against property or protest, against the literal driving through people and murdering them, or walking into a church and massacring 9 people, or walking into a mosque and murdering 50 people. I mean, I can't equate that. It just doesn't have that. As far as Antifa as an organization or as a movement, it's really hard to quantify. It's not the same as a white nationalist because they don't have groups. It's more of like an ideology of being against Nazism or against fascism. I would argue that we should probably all be anti-fascist, right? I mean, if we're Americans, we should all be anti-fascist. But that's not to say that there aren't people who go and protest and cause damage to property. But I think what I've seen in my experience is that, these are not, people who are clouded in terrorism. They're clergy members in many cases. They're people, who serve us our coffees, when we go to Starbucks. They're people who really believe that their neighborhoods are unsafe because of racism. And who have seen physical racists come into their neighborhoods and murder people, so they're standing up to that. So until I'm not saying I'm ready to jump into that crowd or anything, and I'm not sure that I'm ready to defend, any criminal activity on anybody's part.
Of course not. No violence, whether it's left or right. We're not condoning.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't condone that, but I certainly cannot equate, the efforts of anti-fascists to the efforts of racists whose only intention is to hurt other people because of the color of their skin, or who they love, or who they pray to. It is not an equivalency in my eyes.
When you were in one of these groups, when you yourself were a Nazi skinhead, you were told proactively to go hurt Black people, kill Black people, do damage and commit acts of violence against people that were on the hit list of the master race, as it were?
Absolutely.
That's what their goal is to?
It was encouraged. It wasn't, it wasn't ever a direct, Christian, take this and go do that. But it was, this is what we all need to be doing. This is the way we need to live our lives. Those people are bad. We need to exclude them. And if we have to, violently. So yes, it was in the DNA of being a white nationalist. It's in the DNA of being a Proud Boy. It's in the DNA of being a Klansman. It's in the DNA of being a neo-Nazi skinhead or, American Nazi Party, that they are better and they must eliminate, not just separate, they must eliminate the enemy. If somebody tells you they're a separatist, a white separatist, and not a white supremacist, they're lying to you. Because it's not it's not the mandate for anybody or in anybody's ideological DNA that the enemy must be treated by separation over annihilation.
Now, first of all, once again, thank you for what you're telling us, how you're informing us, and what you're doing for all of us. In your own situation, that which pulled you out of that lifestyle began with a woman, I think, right? A woman who loved you and the compassion of a woman. You yourself have now helped hundreds of people get out of that life. Tell us, I already read that paragraph from your book. You believe in redemption. You listen to people's stories. Is there, and of course there's some wonderful stories, I want everybody to know. The book is called Breaking Hate, Confronting the New Culture of Extremism. And it's a series of stories of people who have been pulled into this hateful ideology, including Dylan Ruff, by the way, who was radicalized online. Is there anything that you can tell us, maybe a particular story? I was very much moved by the man who wanted to kill Muslims, and then you took him to a mosque, and they're all like good friends. But anything that I think people would understand a little more, how the de-radicalization process occurs.
Yeah, and that's a great story, and I'm happy to tell it. Reggie was somebody who had reached out to me after reading my first book, my memoir, and he wasn't very happy with it, and because I had gotten out of the movement, he was somebody who had just gotten in, or had been in for a while. And when he reached out to me, he did so kind of in a way to try and attack me, but I didn't respond in an aggressive way. I responded in a way that was just having a dialogue, and I don't think he was expecting that. So I continued that dialogue with him, and I learned a lot about him, that he was somebody who had, a horrible upbringing, had an abusive father who was an alcoholic, who beat his mother and beat him. That he was a drug user for some time and then got clean and went into the military. And when he went into the military, he really went in with no purpose and no identity and no community whatsoever, and really found it there. And it was healthy for him for a while until he started to lose sight of what that was about. And then he started to make his pain about somebody else causing that pain. And it became Muslims who suddenly were, the cause of all of his distress. So he developed this hatred for Muslims. And of course, 9/11 had happened. So that, whole notion of that had focused him in that direction. And he had built up, this real hatred. And when he came back from the military, he was struggling, and he got a hold of my book. He contacted me, and one of the first questions I asked him, was when I'd met him, was if he had ever met a Muslim person before. And this was after he had told me a story about him walking through the park with his daughter. He was pushing a stroller with his daughter in it, and he saw a Muslim man praying, and he wanted to hurt the man. He wanted to kick him, and I kind of talked him off the ledge on that. And I flew out to visit him very shortly after that, and I asked him, have you ever met a Muslim, Reggie? And he said, no, why would I want to? I don't want anything to do with them. They hate me and I hate them, and I don't want anything to do with them. And little did he know I was arranging a meeting at a mosque with a friend who was an imam, who I certainly wouldn't have put anybody in that situation had I thought it was going to be dangerous. I didn't think Reggie was dangerous at all. But I wanted to challenge him, and I wanted to do so in a way where he challenged himself. And it wasn't me just telling him he was wrong or that what he believed was wrong. That was obvious. I knew that was wrong. And I suspect he knew it too. But I introduced him to this imam who was a friend, and suddenly his whole world changed. And he was scared going in, but he had left thinking that this was his new best friend, somebody who he shared things with. And the very strange thing that they bonded over, and I always tell this because it's a hilarious story, is they both loved Chuck Norris. And
I heard you say that in your TED Talk.
And they were just, quoting Chuck Norris lines and this and that. And, so they found a way to bond over something that wasn't, aggressive. And, I'm happy to say that they're friends now. And then they spend time together. And Reggie has completely changed his life because of, not just that encounter, but other things that have happened in his life and other things that have challenged him. And I think that those are the things that are so important in our life, that we really, as human beings, find people to give compassion to, even if it's obvious that maybe they don't deserve it, because it really is such a powerful, powerful thing, compassion and empathy.
Well, you talk about empathy for the person who's actually lost in that world, empathy for them, and how can we talk about their lack of empathy for blacks or for Jews or for gay people or immigrants if we ourselves are not willing to show some empathy for them? I got some insight into Holocaust denial from your book, because I could understand where someone lost in that cannot face the evil, the human evil that is perpetrated in the name of this ideology. So of course they just deny that the Holocaust happened. Yeah. Like it's a bunch of walking through the, walking through a bed of roses. Nobody really gets hurt here, or such dissociation from the human suffering that is involved in this kind of evil. I also want to mention that your first book is called White American Youth, My Descent into America's Most Violent Hate Movement.
Thank you.
Christian, I think going forward, your voice will be even more important. Obviously, your voice is very amplified. People know who you are. People are reading your books. I hope people will definitely read Breaking Hate. But I am a big supporter of being of operationalizing all this. FDR talked about how during the Depression we needed relief, recovery, and reform. We are going through a period of such crisis in this country. Obviously, people need relief. Obviously, we need recovery. But on the other side of this, we need reform. We need to do things differently. That's why I felt so strongly about a massive front-ending of resources towards America's children, because too many American children are falling through the cracks. They're not finding at school. They're not finding at home the identity that you keep talking about, the community you keep talking about, the purpose you keep talking about, your ICPs. They are falling through the cracks, the potholes that you talk about. And this is not something we can just say is about the parents, especially since so much public policy is responsible for why the parents are living on such survival that they feel they don't have the time or the bandwidth for the kids. The other thing I feel strongly about is a Department of Peace. We need the professional de-radicalizers, such as yourself. The whole idea of practitioners in peace building, these are literal peace building techniques that people like yourself learn. And I'm assuming you train other people to do as you do, yes? Other formers?
Yeah, I do.
Correct?
Yeah.
Well, I hope there will be that Truth and Reconciliation Commission. But I hope as we move forward, it will go even beyond that, so that these things become operationalized in huge ways. I found your book chilling, and I was already very, very concerned. But your book speaks of a depth to the problem, tentacles of the problem, and most importantly, how sophisticated these operations are. And from what you say, they don't really go away. They go underground for a while. They rebrand. They figure out what the culture wants. They figure out how to look good. They figure out the words to use. And you got to learn what the codes are.
Oh yeah,
you got to learn what the codes are.
They're much more resilient than we are. That's their whole game is being resilient around, our grievances, our problems. They feed off of that, and in many cases they create the conditions that keep us at each other's throats so that they can use that. So yes, they're very good at that.
Well, with people like you informing us, showing us, speaking so beautifully about the compassion that is necessary in order to root out the problem, I am hopeful. And for me, this was my own very personal conflict. How do I stand against hate and commit my life to love? And what I learned from you, what you articulate so profoundly, is yes, hate is a problem. No, we must not look away. Yes, we must address this. Yes, we must hold people accountable. And yes, love is the answer. That love is not weak. The love you display towards people who are lost in this. You don't just display love for their victims, which you do very profoundly in your book, but you display a love for them, which enables them to come back from that road to hell. This is a service not only to them, Christian, but to all of us. From the bottom of my heart, on behalf of everyone listening, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Marianne. I'm grateful that somebody did that for me, 20 some years ago and gave me that opportunity. And I try to do that in my everyday now. I try to be that person I wish would have come up to me in that alley when I was 14 years old and given me just a different alternative. Thank you very much.
The fact you're doing it for the whole country now. Anything else that you'd like to add?
It's been wonderful to be here. I hope to hear more from you with the new administration. I really, I got turned on to you during the campaigning, and I really love some of your ideas. I think that, in order to make progress, it's going to take a lot of voices and a lot of really smart people to make that happen. I hope to hear more from you as well.
Thank you. Right back at you. I hope we meet again. Thank you so much.
Cheers.
So I'm sure you agree with me that there was a lot of food for thought in that conversation with Christian Picciolini. And as I said to him during the interview, I hope that we will see more and more operationalization of the kind of de-radicalization that he represents, that we can as a society really hold in mind what this is all about and do everything that's necessary and everything that's possible to rout this problem from our midst. Okay, it's time for Ask Marianne. I have a few questions here I'm going to look into, and I hope you enjoy this. This is from Vicky. Hi, Marianne. Very special to be able to write to you. You have so positively affected my life, and the world is a better place because of your influence. Thank you, Vicky. I could go on longer as I feel I'm writing a dear friend, but I'm anxious to have you answer my question. I would really appreciate it if you'd explain your plan for college debt forgiveness. I agree with so much of what you say, but I don't fully understand your view on this one. Would you forgive everyone's debt? Would it be dependent on income? How would you hold people accountable for making the wrong decision about the colleges they attended, where they choose a too expensive school, when there were very good quality schools in their state that would not have strangled them with debt? I feel some people decided to buy a Mercedes when a Ford Escape would have served them just as well, if not better, and not left them in such a precarious financial situation. I really am looking forward to your answer. I am committed to helping my neighbor, and I could easily accept giving forgiveness for those in need. I'm just anxious to hear your parameters for this proposal. Many thanks for your invaluable life's work, Marianne. Oh, thank you. Thank you very, very much, Vicki. Okay, first of all, we have $1.5 trillion college loan debt, and we have 45 million people who are saddled with these debts. Now, for the vast, vast, vast majority of people who are saddled with these debts, what this means is that they can't get out from under the burden, the financial burden that this is putting on their lives. Now, the financial burden that it's putting on their lives is keeping them from being able to get in the game. Somebody getting in the game is what stimulates the economy. You can't be a capitalist if you don't have any capital. So many of these people, particularly young people, who are saddled with these horrible college loans, want nothing more than to get out there and get started. They have ideas for businesses. They wish they had $2,500 in discretionary spending so that they could start their site and do what it is that they want to do. And so it is suppressing people, and because it's suppressing people, it is suppressing the economy. Remember, it's society's fault that this even happened to begin with. During the campaign, I remember Elizabeth Warren would often tell the story of what a fine education she got so cheaply. It used to be, when you look at the grants that used to exist, the GI Bill, the Pell Grants, there used to be so many more ways that somebody could achieve in the United States a higher education in a way that did not put them under the strain of these college loans for sometimes decades. I mean, there are baby boomers that are still having to deal with this. So now you have all these people, even you'd be surprised at some of these people who are carrying these debts, doctors who are carrying these debts, lawyers who are carrying these debts. And there are so many people who said, okay, I'm going to take out a college loan so that I can have a career by which I follow my dreams. But then once they get the education, when they look at the career, the path by which they would supposedly follow the dreams that the education makes possible, they actually can't, they figure, because they don't see how they could get those jobs and pay off these college loans. And then you add to that they also have so many Americans working at jobs they hate. This is even before the pandemic. So many Americans working at jobs that they hate simply because that's where they get the benefits, such as health care. That's where they get the money that they'll be able, hopefully, to pay off these college loans, even though they'll never be able to use that education because they have to pay off the loans. This is just wrong. It is just wrong. Now, you talk about somebody taking advantage of the system. Yeah, there are always people who take advantage of the system. You cannot compare that to the way big pharmaceutical companies take advantage of the system, or big oil takes advantage of the system, or insurance companies take advantage of the system, or defense contractors take advantage of the system. I mean, the advantage taken of the system, the looting of the system is on the part of huge corporate entities through obscene tax cuts, tax subsidies, etc. So would there be people who probably get their loans removed and that wasn't, very cool because really they could afford it? Probably. That's going to happen. But I think the main point is, for me, the fact that some people are going to get off easier maybe than they should, that's going to be, if it exists, which it probably will, we're talking about a tiny percentage of the people. A tiny percentage of the people. Everyone else, it's going to be a chance for them to breathe, especially given what's happening now. The reason, people like myself have been talking about removing the college loan debt from people out of just pure compassion and a sense of economic justice. Now people are talking about it because we're going to have to get this economy rolling. But when it comes to the college loan debt, a lot of economists themselves are saying this would be one way to help stimulate the economy. I hope I answered your question. And that's how I feel. Okay. Next is from Jared. Dear Ms. Williamson, my name is Jared, and I'm a master's student at Southeast Missouri State University studying public history with a concentration in historic preservation. That's very cool. My main research interests are women in positions of power in the Western Hemisphere, minorities in government, and presidential history. I first became acquainted with you during your time on the campaign trail during the previous election cycle. While my passion is history and preserving it for future generations, I have also had a deep interest in politics. However, your politics are different, which I feel is important. Your views are inspiring and hopeful, even when I do not always agree. Even though I'm only 22, I have voted for both major parties in the elections since I became of age to vote, as well as independent candidates. Well, you've done a lot, Jared. You're only 22. You've done a lot of voting. I have since researched you, watching numerous videos, and read your beautiful book, A Politics of Love, a Handbook for a New American Revolution. Thank you, Jared. You are absolutely riveting to me. Also, that is not my intention behind writing you. No, actually, you say, alas, that is not my intention behind writing you. I am a 2-time kidney transplant recipient, receiving one when I was 10 and the other when I was 18. Because of my experience with healthcare from an early age, which I have been incredibly fortunate to receive great care, I was interested in your thoughts on organ donation. In France, they have legislation that now makes every person born within the country an organ donor unless one decides to opt out. Do you believe this is a proper step for the United States to take? Does this step on any rights? How can we improve the organ donation set up in this country, which has thousands waiting for organs at any given time? I would love to talk to you personally or just hear your thoughts via your podcast. I never miss an episode. Thank you. Just being a voice for those who are unheard, Jared Anderson. Wow. Jared, I never thought about that, and I did not know that they passed that law in France. Wow. I mean, I knew that people are waiting for the heart transplant, waiting for the liver transplant. I knew all that. But it had never occurred to me that this is one way to deal with that problem. My first thought when you wrote it was, not everybody would want to do it. I know on my driver's license, I know I've signed up that I would be an organ donor, but, not everybody would be comfortable. Some people would not be comfortable for religious reasons. But what you say here is in France, they have legislation that now makes every person born within the country an organ donor unless one decides to opt out. Wow. I think that's amazing, actually. My first response is, yeah, that's fabulous, as long as people have a chance to opt out. And I think it's so beautiful, Jared, that you who have had 2 transplants, wow, I'm really impressed by you on a lot of levels, and that you are turning this challenge in your own life into something beautiful, which is your own advocacy for other people who are waiting for transplants themselves. Count me in. I think it's really great. Really great. And if you have an article about this that I could post on my social media, it's all about awareness. Like, until I read your letter, I had never even thought that was a way to deal with this issue. Let's get the conversation started. If I can help in any way, please let me know. Thank you. Okay, we have one more, and that is from Shelley. Dear Marianne, I'm really enjoying your podcast. Thank you. And I feel so much more hopeful and refreshed after I listen. Good, that makes me happy. I'd love to hear you have a conversation with Colin Kaepernick about his work with Black Lives Matter. I would specifically like to hear his thoughts and yours about defunding/abolishing the police and prisons versus reform. Thank you for all you do. Wow, I would love to talk to Colin Kaepernick. We have never asked him, but I maybe we will, huh, Lauren? Let's write Colin Kaepernick. Maybe he would do that. We are certainly having guests who are talking to us further about issues of race in America, and I'm looking forward to all of those conversations. And we'll see if we can get Colin Kaepernick. Who knows? Maybe he'll say yes. Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you to everyone. If you are enjoying the podcast, please rate and review on iTunes and check us out on YouTube. Tell people about the podcast if you're enjoying it. I want to thank everyone who makes this happen. Lauren Selsky, Wendy Zoller, Amanda Elliott, Austin Kendrick, and everyone at Cast Media. And many thanks to you. I hope that you do feel that this podcast brings you conversations that matter. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be here with you. And thank you so much. I'll see you next time.